Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us for our first webinar to introduce and share a lot of information about our new rubric for our We the People simulated congressional hearing performance assessment. I'm Donna Phillips. I'm the Vice President and Chief Program Officer here at the Center. And we have a really great session planned for everyone tonight. This is our first session on the rubric. It's a general introduction to the rubric. We do want to get to know who our audience is, though, so you'll be invited to introduce yourself in the chat. But for anyone here tonight who wants a more deep dive for a specific context for the rubric, whether you're a classroom teacher, a state coordinator, a judge, someone interested in how this works explicitly in the hearings or in the classroom, we do have follow-up sessions about our rubric that we'll share at the end of tonight as well. With that, I will turn it over to Emily, our Senior Manager of Programs and Professional Development, and the one who spearheaded our work to revise our rubric. And we'll jump right into our agenda tonight and looking forward to a really in-depth and interactive session with everyone. And thanks again for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. And yes, and as a way of introduction, now would be a great time for you to go ahead and drop in the chat who you are, where you're joining us from, and your relationship with We the People. So whether you're a teacher, a state coordinator, a judge, a fan, what have you, we would love to hear from you in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll just overview what we're going to cover this evening. So we're basically going to cover the why, the how, and the what of this new rubric. So we'll be talking through why we came to the conclusion that we wanted to do a rubric update, what the process was like and who was involved. And then we'll go ahead and get into a deep dive so that we all better understand the design of the new rubric and the content of the new rubric. And we will have one of our rubric committee members as our special guest this evening to help us walk through that when we get to that point. We'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end and as we go throughout the presentation as well. So as you have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. And then we'll wrap up. As Donna mentioned, we will make sure that you have dates for the audience-specific follow-ups, in addition to some other opportunities as well. All right, so Donna, where do we have folks joining us from today?
We have a lot of We the People teachers from all over. We have Arizona, we have Katie Bolin from Trumbull and Tara Kelly from New York City. We have Sheridan, Wyoming represented, Richmond, Virginia, Kentucky. We have some of our state coordinators here. So we literally are all across the country, and that's very exciting.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for giving us an hour and a bit of your time this evening. We really do appreciate you joining us and being prepared to learn more and ask questions. So a quick word about the questions. As I said, please use the chat feature. If your question relates to, kind of what we're talking about in the moment, we'll probably address it then. But there is a chance that we might hold your question to the end. So I just want to make sure that, you don't feel like we're ignoring your question. I promise we will get to all the questions over the course of the presentation. All righty. So first things first, the need for a new rubric. So this has been, I think, a very long time coming. We've heard for many years from state coordinators, from judges, and from some teachers that it would be nice if ... the rubric contained any number of different things or any number of different features. So the process of thinking about what a new rubric might be, what it might include, started really many years ago, but it started in earnest basically earlier this spring when we started to kind of compile feedback and input from those conversations with teachers and judges and coordinators. And we also then asked for formal feedback from people who had previously judged the national finals. So we collected kind of all of that, and that helped us figure out what are the particular points of concern or confusion, and where shall we go from here. So that was really what drove the decision. And we got started really right after the national final finished in the spring in 2023. So we got started as soon as we could in an effort to be able to get a finished rubric ready to go by the time you all came back to the 23-24 school year. All right, and the committee that was officially brought together to craft the new rubric, the folks involved all wear many hats. In particular, we were looking for folks who were board members, who understand the strategic input and the alignment of We the People with the center's mission. We were looking for state coordinators who use the rubric both with teacher training and with competitions. We were looking for teachers who had experience with classroom instruction and perhaps their own competition experience. We were obviously very interested as well in making sure that this worked from a score team perspective. So that was a key feature. And then we had alumni of the program as well. So some of those alums have served as judges, and so they also understand what the rubric experience is like from both the student perspective as well as a judging perspective. So who was the committee then? The committee involved these lovely folks here listed on the left. So a huge thank you to Hank Chambers, Sean McClelland, Trish Everett, Beth Ratway, Donald Lanier, Michael Blau, and then Donna and myself. We met weekly starting in May to work this project through the course of the summer. So a major thank you to those who joined us and put in a lot of work in their off time. So our process for the committee worked through, first we looked at the rubric that we had and the feedback, of course. Then we looked at other rubrics because almost everyone who sat on that committee is experienced with other forms of competition, be it mock trial. Some people had tinkered with the We the People rubric on their own and made some other design changes. So we looked at other rubrics and made just commentary on what do we like, what do we not like, what might we want to utilize in our new rubric system. So that got us to an early design phase. We also thoroughly discussed the criteria that we wanted to use, what sort of norming practices would be involved, range of scoring, and what instructional implications the rubric had. So, you know, we have folks who sat on that committee, and all of you sitting here in our session this evening, you represent the use of this rubric at a lot of different levels. And so one of the first things we recognized was that this rubric needed to be usable from a classroom only situation all the way up to the national finals. So we talked through different use cases, what would make sense in the classroom, what would make sense at national finals, how can we marry those things? And then in the early part of August, we sent our draft to teachers, judges, and state coordinators for comments. And we got quite a lot of comments back, and that ultimately resulted in the final draft. So here was our timeline. We did publish the rubric to the website on the same day as our state finals questions came out. All right, Donna.
Sure. It was a very robust and interesting and exciting process to work with everyone in thinking about a new rubric. And I'm so glad that there are so many teachers here tonight. I was a We the People teacher for 15 years in my own classroom, middle school and high school. And what I want to really emphasize to everyone is that the rubric serves as a piece of the We the People instructional program, curricular program. And first and foremost, the rubric is an instructional tool. And so what I always really loved about the rubric that I used with my students was that the criteria on it really guided the learning that my students were going to do. I had to make sure, as you all do, that my students were bringing in historical perspectives and historical events, tying everything to constitutional reasoning, you know, drawing a through line to current events and contemporary issues, no matter what the question was. All of that got woven into that rubric. And when we, see classroom and state and national hearings, we know that that's what our teachers are doing as well. And so we wanted to make sure that this rubric kept that, because to me, to us, that is what true deep civic and constitutional learning is. And that's at the heart of our program and the impact of our program. And so we wanted to make sure that the way we reworked this rubric continued to emphasize that type of learning and drive that type of instruction in the hands of teachers, and also included civic education best practices. So being very explicit that here's where we are using application, here's where we want to see explanation, here's where we want to see synthesis and discussion. So we really took a strong instructional approach to the rubric, while still carrying through, what it means civic knowledge wise to do the We the People program and to be successful at the hearings. And then the further point is that while this is a tool to drive instructional practice, and it's also a tool to measure students' performance at a hearing or a showcase, it's not an assessment tool as a standalone assessment tool. So of course, you're all going to use this rubric to drive your instructional decisions and to give students feedback and to help them monitor their own progress as they're writing and rewriting and drafting their speeches and also practicing for their follow-up conversations. And there are points involved. And so those points are the things that we use to figure out which group and which class, prevailed if it's a competitive hearing. It's also a way to give students feedback on their learning and the progress that they're showing on their learning. And so however you choose to use the rubric to continue that ongoing cycle of feedback and revision and to push students' thinking and their learning further, keep in mind that if you come up with a scale, and we'll go very deep into how to use it. So it's not, it's not like a lockstep thing, and it's different than how we used to use the rubric in the past. But the score on it isn't necessarily a student grade. And so you can see all the things we've written here. And if you're more interested in this aspect of it, please come back to the teacher-focused one, because we'll really go into depth about it. And we'll talk about how this drives the feedback process and the student learning and growth, as opposed to just here's your end grade because this is how you did on the hearing.
Okay, so a bit about the new rubric's features and benefits. So some of the elements that you'll see in the new rubric, and I imagine that many of you have already looked pretty closely over this, but the key features include comment sections. It has criteria guidance, and a major difference between the old version and this version is the separation of the opening statement as its own category, which we'll get into in a little bit. And so one of the things that we also wanted to point out is there are some elements of this rubric that are really just a refinement of the previous one. So when it comes to some of the scoring categories, I think many of you will see a lot of familiar concepts, if not the wording being a little bit different. So at the end of the day, we really felt like what we were doing was refining the rubric more than it was creating a one from whole cloth. We also really wanted to highlight that the benefits of the new rubric includes a much closer tie to the Educating for American Democracy initiative. And Donna can walk us through a couple of those highlights.
Sure. whether your district or your school or your state has started looking at the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, it does articulate really strong support for civic and historical history education. And that's something that the We the People program has done from the beginning. It was an easy correlation to make between the We the People program and the goals of this national endeavor. So you're not going to see EAD on the rubric, but should that be something that interests you or your school district, there are some very strong connections between how we are evaluating the simulated congressional hearing and really the learning that has been there all along, but now we're just calling more attention to it, and the goals of this national roadmap. So taking multiple perspectives and critical thinking, showing critical thinking, we're calling that out explicitly. Again, that's what We the People students have always done, but now we're making it explicit in the rubric, and it's really exciting to be able to honor that this is the type of thing that's always been part of the simulated congressional hearing. And then that comprehensive understanding of civics and history together. Again, something we've always done through We the People. And now we can say exactly, yes, here it is in EAD as well. Application to real world situations and the balanced and thoughtful discussion, which highlights that civil dialogue. So again, all the things that have been tradition are just kind of mapped into the most current best practices that again, We the People has always understood. And we have these correlations on our website, and you can use this bit.ly as well. But if you go to our website, civiced.org, and pull down, where do I have it? I think it's under Learn. But anyway, you could also go to the bit.ly.
Yes, and this is also a great time to say we will be sharing a view version of the slides after this evening's presentation. So if there is anything you wanted to check for the hyperlink, but also if it is useful or important to you to have those 4 direct relationships that we just pointed out, if that's important for your school, for your division, for any reason, you will have those front and center that you can feel free to copy and paste to another presentation if you need to. Okay, so getting into the design. So for one thing, we'll give a major shout out to our designer, Brad, who did a really amazing job with the design of the new rubric. So the intention of this, just from a design standpoint, is landscape oriented to allow for as much room as we could get to include comment spaces. And what we wanted to try to do was offer the opportunity for whoever is on the simulated congressperson side of the chair, whether that's in a showcase, whether it's a judge, whether it's a teacher running a practice session. We wanted folks to be able to have the opportunity to take notes in areas where the students exceeded expectations or areas where the students might have an opportunity for growth. So realizing that it is still kind of tiny, we did want to make those opportunities available. All right, and so you would also see in each of the 5 categories that if you choose to use the color version, the scoring element of each category is highlighted in bright yellow. So as you're training your judges, your volunteers, whoever is hearing the students, it should be very easy for them to see. Okay, and then in the center for each of the categories that we'll talk through, we have these little checkboxes that are under the category of meets expectations. And it's really important at the outset for us as the members of the committee to say that in many of these categories, the intent was not necessarily to have the students do every single thing on every single category. And we're going to talk about that when it comes to the evidence and the application portion. This is just a way for us to be able to capture what does it look like when the students have met our basic expectation of this category. So we'll go over that more clearly, but the checkboxes were meant as an easier tool for the judges to be able to just sort of tick the box when they have heard that, yes, I have just heard the students in front of me say that all the elements of the question were met. Great. I've heard from all the students on this panel. Check. So just a quick way for judges to do what many of them were already doing, which was just keeping a tally mark on their sheets. Okay, so as I just said, when using the checkboxes, these are meant to guide your assessment. These are not supposed to be scored individually. Each of those checkboxes are meant to contribute to the overall score of that category. And students are not expected to reference every example given. So what I would suggest as you are working with judges or volunteers is that they have a highlighter handy, and as they are listening to the students, they can certainly take notes, but it may also be quite easy for them to just say, I just heard a constitutional text referenced, I just heard a secondary source referenced, I just heard a historical event, so they can keep track as they go of things that they have heard. So again, we are not expecting the students to provide every single thing in every single sentence, just the majority will be fine. All right, and so some features that you will not find if you are familiar with the previous rubric. On purpose, we did not list a scoring range finder. The rubric instructs judges or volunteers to provide a whole number score up to 10 in each of the categories. So we debated this as a committee, and at the end of the day, we really did not feel that any range that we provided would give the judges any more room to interpret what they saw, and that every judge at the end of the day has a different perception of what average and above average looks like, and they are going to figure out how to score accordingly. So without us needing to say a 5 is an average, a 4 is below average, the judges will be able to find that range. And then the other element that is not on this rubric is a tiebreaker score box. We have a suggestion for a new tie-breaking method, which we will cover at the end of the presentation. All right, and so the 5 categories that the students will be scored in are the opening statement, which again stands alone. And then the following 4 elements are built off of the follow-up period of the hearing. So this is evidence, analysis and understanding, application, and discussion. So as I said, each category is scored out of a total of 10, and then the total score is now out of 50 points. So each category then is worth 20% of the total score. So for those of you who are in a position to be training folks to use this, the 10-point scale remains the same from the previous rubric. So that will not be new or earth-shattering to your previous volunteers. All right, so we're going to walk through the different elements in more detail, but I will ask my special guest, Hank Chambers, to come join me for this portion of the presentation. So, Hank, would you like to mention anything further about our reasoning and logic behind separating out the opening statement and anything else you think folks ought to know?
Absolutely, absolutely. Emily and Don, of course, have done a fantastic job of shepherding this process and providing a ton of good advice, suggestion, information, et cetera, and so forth. There was a lot of debate and discussion over what was going to go into the new rubric. Indeed, whether to call it a rubric was an issue. I tend to be a contrarian on that one, but I'm okay with calling it a rubric nonetheless. Part of what we were trying to do and think about was making sure that we were as transparent as possible. So one of the things that you may see and you may think is that this rubric is a little fuzzier than the last rubric. If you go and map this rubric onto the last one, I think you're going to find that the lion's share of information is pretty similar. What the new rubric does is simplify the thought process. I think simplify the thought process of judges. So if you think about the 5 different areas in this way, I think it's reasonable to suggest that it's fairly clear. One, the opening statement. The opening statement stands alone for a couple reasons. One, it stands alone because it's the one that is most, how shall we put this, massaged by outside forces. That's not a negative. No one's saying that anyone is engaging in any inappropriate behavior by having folks from the outside talk to students, et cetera, and so forth. I may very well serve that purpose for a number of schools. So that's not a problem. But the opening statement is the piece that's the most massaged by outside forces. So as a consequence, we wanted to make sure that it remains, that it keeps value, but we wanted to set it apart. Some people on the committee thought about the radical notion of possibly not scoring the opening, right? And instead saying the opening sort of starts the process of the discussion, and then we move on from there. But I think it's fair to say some folks were not quite as thrilled with the concept of getting away from scoring the opening. So that's why the opening stands apart. The next 3 portions are really sort of tracked onto the idea of what does the Constitution say, what does it mean, and how does it apply? And if you look at those 3 portions, you'll see, oh, that's what they're doing with that. I mean, we call the second piece evidence, but in a number of ways, what we're really talking about with that is, hey, how does the Constitution, what does the Constitution really say about this issue? Now, yes, some of that will be in the opening statement as well. But what the discussion allows you to do is push for more. The likelihood that in the 4 minutes the team will have talked about all that's in the Constitution that's relevant to the point is pretty slender. The third piece of the puzzle, the what does it mean? We're really talking about the discussion regarding, well, what does the Constitution mean? We know what it says about the question that's being asked. Well, what does it mean? The fourth piece is, how does it apply? In fact, it says application, so it's pretty clear how does it apply. If you think of it in that way, it's a little easier for us to divide and segment how well the teams have talked about the question and the issue. Right. Then the last piece, the discussion piece, is really an overall score regarding how did the discussion work? That is, was it just see Constitution, cite Constitution, move on? Or was it a discussion that really gets at the nature of what the Constitution has to say about the question that was asked? Another reason why we thought that was relatively important is that you can have some teams that are not all that strong or are not terribly strong on the specifics, but really have a nice understanding of what the Constitution in general means. Now, those teams may not be scored all that well in the middle 3 parts, but by goodness, at the end of the day, if the team was game, if they were very willing to discuss and talk about the general issues, even if they may not have been perfectly on point with what they were saying precisely, then we want an opportunity to say to a team, look, you guys did a really nice job of the discussion regarding the discussion piece and engaging with the material, even if maybe you weren't citing all the right stuff. That's the concept of what we were trying to get at. And like I say, we know it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. It reflects what the committee was thinking. And of course, remember, it's always going to be a work in progress. Now, I'm sure we'll use the rubric for a year or 2, but I'm sure that additional comments about how it's working well, how it's not working well, are things that will be taken into account. So I've spoken for long enough on that one. Sorry about that. Emily, jump in and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So I'm going to backtrack just slightly for the piece about the opening statement. So, again, if this is important to anyone to have access to, here are some further reasonings behind the separation of the opening. I do want to start then. Hank did a great overview of the different elements of the rubric. So I want to take a closer look at each of these kind of one by one. So one thing that I put in the little boxes here on the screens are Hank's really useful, I think, frames of reference. So evidence, what we're looking for is, what does the Constitution or the other historical document say? So you all have seen our questions year over year. So the document in question might be a Federalist paper, might be the Voting Rights Act. It might be a quote from a Supreme Court justice, whatever it is. What is it that quote or that document is saying? And I really want to highlight that we have used constitutional text and constitutional principles very, very heavily in this rubric, rather than saying the Constitution, big C. And one of the reasonings behind that is that for anyone who teaches this or has judged units 1 or 6, it is sometimes very hard for the students to really dig for a concrete big C constitutional reference, depending on the question. So we really tried to word these different elements so that we are referencing constitutional principles. We're giving an opportunity for the impact of those principles in the context of when they were written. So whether it's Locke, whether it's this year we have the Protestant Reformation, we have an opportunity to hear from students talking about the principles at play rather than the document, the Constitution, big C. So I do want to point that out. So that's kind of the spotlight on evidence. All right, so then we move on to the analysis understanding. So in Hank's parlance, so what does that document, that quote, what does it mean? And according to whom? So when we're talking about references to Supreme Court cases, we are going to be looking for students to say, okay, well, if this is the decision, according to whom was this decision made? So it might be a reference to the judicial decision. It might be a reference to society at the time. So how does, we have referenced up here as the possibility, a societal movement. So how do people writ large during any particular period of time, how do they understand it? And that might differentiate between the legal community versus the people. We are looking here as well for students to recognize that there are probably multiple perspectives, whether they are looking for a constitutional issue, an interpretation, an argument by a scholar, what have you. So looking for the different perspectives, which I will point out is something that the judges would often have done anyway. So for those of you who have judged, often if the students did not already bring up an alternative perspective on an issue, that was probably one of the first things you were going to follow up with, just to make sure that they understood both sides of a particular issue. So this is what we're looking for the analysis and understanding piece. All right, and then once again, the parlance of the amazing Hank. Application, how does our understanding of the document, the issue, the text, how does it apply? How did it apply historically? How does it apply now? How does this issue, this constitutional principle, how might it apply in an international context? So, once again, this is listed in here as a possibility framework from other countries. We do not expect that will be relevant to most of the questions the students get asked, right? I mean, it will be relevant to some. It will not necessarily be relevant to many, and we are certainly not expecting the students to be experts in comparative world constitutions. That would be amazing, but that is not our expectation. So I also want to take this moment to point out, again, this is a list of options, and you're just going to kind of highlight as you go what you heard the kids reference.
Can I jump in, Emily, with one other thought? So we pressure tested all the parts of this rubric across all 6 units. So we really wanted to make sure, as Emily's been emphasizing and Hank, started off with, that these criteria are equally applicable in any unit. And so I think that was something that with the old rubric, we had challenges with. If you took a literal interpretation, are you a strict constructionist of that rubric or a natural constructionist or a loose constructionist? Madison would say I'm a natural constructionist, but we wanted to make it so that if you did take a literal interpretation of the rubric, it was still equally applicable and affirming to any unit and any potential question, as opposed to very specific constitutional application. And we wanted to make sure that judges experienced and new and everywhere in between, as well as teachers, could find resonance within the words of the rubric to identify what the students are learning and doing well within those descriptors, and push them into, potential for even deeper learning. So we did that across all 6 units, every single word in this rubric.
Thanks, Donna.
Yeah, can I jump in and say that we did have discussion about how the questions might change a little bit based on how the rubric would work out. So it's not just change in rubric, keep the questions the same. It's let's think about how the questions might very well flow, or how the rubric may have an interplay with the question. So there's a lot of thought that went into a lot of those issues as well.
Definitely. Thank you, Hank. All right. And then the discussion element. So this, Hank gave you a great overview. This was born out of the former category of participation. But what a lot of us found in working with teachers, working with students directly in the classroom, and then going all the way up to a competitive setting, the participation as it was formerly conceived, students would still get full marks if all they said during the follow-up period was, "I agree with my colleague." So if we have literally heard words come out of the mouths of all the kids on the panel, they get the full marks, but that doesn't provide any sort of substance. So what we wanted this discussion category to become was a true measure of how well and how substantive the students have been able to build upon the arguments that they laid out in their opening statement, and then how well they can build arguments through the course of the discussion with their judges. So are they substantively building on each other? Not just, I agree with my colleague, but I agree with my colleague and here's why, or I disagree with my colleague and here's why. And, for those of you who have judged or who have taught, what this looks like when you can have the conversation with students that gets progressively more challenging, that the students are seeing gray areas that they didn't already see when they were first working it through their question. So this is an area that we're really excited about, and we think we hope anyway that it better articulates what we would like the students to get out of the experience of interacting with the judges. All right, so I don't know if in the interest of time, we will actually do this. I will say this, we have included a hearing in the slide deck, and you are welcome to watch it. And it was a very lengthy question. It's a 3-part question there on the right. But what I will mention is, if you would like to watch this through later with the rubric and just kind of break it down, you certainly can. This is something that we will do with teachers and with judges during their respective rubric webinars. But for now, we'll skip it. There we go. Okay. I would like to point out as well that we have worked on a bunch of additional supporting documents to go along with the rubric. And you can find them on the same page as the competition questions, which right now are on the link that you see there on the screen. So we built a student version of the rubric, and it was written geared toward an 8th grade reading level. So by no means did we intend to insult the intelligence of 12th graders. But as with the rubric, we needed to make sure that this was something that was understood by the majority of the students doing the We the People experience. And if you are a teacher, you might wish to use this version to introduce the hearing project to students. So here's a little snippet of what this looks like. This explains what the simulated congressional hearing is. And then in each category, there's a description which reads more like instructions. So opening statement, you and your classmates will write and deliver a well-organized and clear speech based on the questions from your unit, et cetera, et cetera. And then it lists the scoring criteria that the judges will have. So the students have their instructions and they see what the judges are looking for, both in the same place. And so that's true then for all of the other follow-up categories as well.
And here, let me jump in for just a moment. This is me being a contrarian, because I know that there's some other people out there who are thinking about this. We understand that the We the People program and the I don't want to say performance, but what occurs is not really a congressional hearing. We understand that it's nothing like a congressional hearing. You will never have 4 folks on a panel who will give a single statement, but it's sort of what we do. It's how we sort of think about it in a way that I think get kids excited. So just want to know, because I know that there's some folks out there who'll go, but it's not a congressional hearing. Don't worry, I'm with you on that one. But it's just sort of the way we do it. Sorry, had to jump in. Go for it.
Thank you, and I'm glad you did. That is a very valid point. All right, so I also wanted to bring up a couple of useful bits about usability. So the comment sections, we talked about that a little bit earlier, where we have opportunities for growth, exceeds expectations. We anticipated that those comments coming from judges and volunteers will be most useful at a classroom setting, as well as a regional and up to a state level competition. The reason being, the students would have the opportunity to take your comments or the judge's comments into consideration as they either modify and rework their statements or as they are preparing to write new ones. So if you are in a position to train judges or you are a judge, just be aware that those comments are in fact very useful. For those of us who organize competitions, something that we will be aware of is to provide enough time in between hearings for the judges to be able to write down comments that are usable and legible. And then if the comments will be distributed directly to the students, make sure that your judges know that. So whether you're in a classroom, school, whatever level of competition, make sure the judges know that. So we really do want the students to be able to use that feedback in a constructive way as they work their way through the We the People experience.
So Emily is being very, very sweet because that's what Emily, because that's who Emily is. I, on the other hand, am a little meaner. So let me just add a little bit to the piece of the puzzle, because during the committee process, I was kind of hard on this piece. When we're at nationals, we are very positive. We understand that that can trigger some problems because we are positive, and then teachers get scores and they say, but folks, we're positive. We don't understand where the scores are coming from. We understand that, and that's the way we do it. Because by the time you get to nationals, frankly, we're not going to be incredibly honest at that point. When folks perform poorly, we're not going to tell them that, because they're still really good, and it's only poor in relation to the very best teams who they've never seen. So we always are going to provide a little bit of a critique, but not a hardcore critique. I am much more likely to give serious critique at states and at regionals and at districts, because I can do it in service of making sure, as Emily noted, we can do it in service of making sure that students are as good as they can be moving on. By the time you get to nationals, we're really Barney the purple dinosaur. We're giving lots of flowers to everybody, even if we all know that things didn't go terribly well. So that's a part of what's going on there. Sorry about that, Emily.
Nope. Thank you. As Hank's introductions are always very helpful for perspective. And to Hank's point, at the national level, the raw score is what is most usable, because it's showtime, it's the competition. So we will, though, hand on heart, make sure that if you are a participant at the national level, that we will build in more time for judges to jot down their comments in between sessions. So I'm not gonna swear that you're gonna get like 10 minutes, but you're gonna get a few more minutes. So.
Judges never have enough time, except the one year I didn't tell time right and I had 20 extra minutes floating around inexplicably, and that was just a fun mistake. But the other thing I'll emphasize, from a teacher classroom use perspective, is that I know that I always would download the rubric, take the criteria, copy it into my own format to create space to do feedback. I also, and I know many of you teachers do this, we had the students evaluate each other, right? You pair your groups up, unit 2 gives feedback to unit 5 and vice versa, self-evaluation. So, we really wanted to honor what we know are the instructional practices that our best We the People, all of our We the People teachers are doing. You're already the best teachers. And just provide those comment sections. Again, they're not big enough, but it does drive that practice of, self-assessment, peer assessment, and then the comments to guide improvement and push their ideas. We will provide a version that you don't have to break open the PDF, because I know that's clunky. We will provide a version, most likely in an Excel spreadsheet format, that will be very easy to add more spaces, copy and paste, and use in your own showcases and hearings, school, state, regional level. Much more easy to manipulate. You'll be able to download your own copy and then move things around. So those comment spaces will be in there, but you'll be able to move them around even more.
Thanks, Donna. Okay, so what if you are in one of these competitive settings, what happens if there's a tie? As we know, ties can happen. So our recommendation is basically creating a situation of just a rank order. So in a classroom, a regional, or a state level competition, whoever the judges are can simply rank the student panels based on the number of teams they saw. So if you saw 5 teams today, just rank them 1 to 5. If you saw 10 teams today, 1 to 10. And we did not put this on the rubric itself, because this is, of course, going to be different from setting to setting, how many spots you need. But it's also not necessarily super useful for the students to see that if you're providing them with the comments in the form of feedback. So we would suggest teachers or coordinators can create a simple form for this purpose that they can use in their own competitive settings. I will also suggest that for the state coordinators, or even teachers, if you're doing this as an in-school competition, if you want each individual judge to rank, you can do it that way. Or if you want to create a situation where the panels agree on a ranking, that adventure is up to you. But either way, a simple rank order should help break the tie. And then at the national level, the judges will be asked to rank the teams they saw each day. They see roughly 12 teams a day. with a similar situation. So at the national level, there's an electronic score sheet, which will be built to accommodate the rankings.
And this is one of those situations where we're talking about transparency. Let me be clear. Every panel I've ever been on at nationals, this is what we do. Frankly, historically, it's what we've done regardless of what the rubric said. That is, we look at the teams, we see them, and over time we ask, what team seemed better than another team? And that team was going to get a higher score, period. Now, each judge did it on his or her own. But the notion that we would rank order teams from 1 to 12 is not foreign, at least on any panel I've served on, is not a foreign concept. So this is really about more transparency than anything else. This is not new with the rubric. This is just explaining what we've always done with the rubric.
Yep. And at the end of the day, the numbers are more meaningful than attempting to give a score out of 100. So it's pretty straightforward. You saw 5 teams today. This was the rank. All right. So then words on implementation of the new rubric. So we will be using the rubric for national finals. We would like to recommend that you use it from the classroom and to guide your preparation through your regional and state hearing events. And as Donna mentioned, different state coordinators may want to make minor modifications that fit their specific needs. So, for example, the idea of making the spreadsheet came from a state coordinator. And some states might wish to add another criteria point that is specific to your state or your locality, if you're using this in the classroom. If the formatting element there, if you need it to be a spreadsheet, that's great. We have also seen folks mess with the formatting orientation so that it's portrait. That's great too. That's fine. And if you need to use this in a classroom and change the point values to work into your larger instructional goals, that's okay. But at the end of the day, if your intent is to work up to the national finals, this is what we'll be working from. Okay, so I'll mention here some next step opportunities, and then we'll open things up for questions. So I mentioned before that we have follow-up webinars that are more audience specific. So next week, we have implementing the rubric in the classroom. So we will have one of our other rubric committee members, who's a teacher. She'll be joining us for that. Then on the 17th, we will be meeting more specifically with state coordinators who will be using this at different contexts in their state. And then on November 2nd, we'll offer a general rubric training for judges. So if you are a judge, or if you train judges, or if you would just like to see what we tell judges, that is going to be the focus of November 2nd. And then for any teachers in the room, we have been offering a We the People competition boot camp for a few weeks since mid-August. And this Saturday, that's our last session, we will be reviewing the rubric with just a group of teachers, and we will be looking at the rubric side by side with this year's state competition questions. So if that is the thing that is of interest to you, please register. Even if you cannot come in person, if you register, I can send you the recording afterward. So I would like to just put that out there for your consideration. All right. So with that, we can open things up to questions. And Donna, I will have to rely on you for the question reading from the chat.
Sure. We've been able to address most of them. But I will highlight some in case not everyone's able to monitor the chat. One question from John Arment is it wondered if there would be a separate competition if there would be an official, if this rubric was also the official competition score sheet. This is, I mean, this is the score sheet you can use in a competition, but the other one where you write down all the scores for each team and submit that, that is not this. And with our new evaluation system, we'll create a high level version of that for different states to use. And we have a small enough group that if I misrepresent your question or you have a follow-up, please feel free to come off mute and jump in, or you continue writing in the chat if you'd like, and I can keep looking at it there. And then, go ahead.
Could you repeat what you just said? I'm not sure I understood that.
So John's question was, there's also a score sheet where you put in like team, you know, Class A, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3 scores. So then you can do like the scoring across. That he wondered if this was that, would count, would be used for that. But we'll have a different whole class collection score sheet. If that makes sense.
Hi, but yeah, basically I was just wondering if this was also, you know, the score sheet that would be printed out and given to judges, if for any states that are doing paper scoring.
Oh, I did misunderstand your question. I'm glad you came off mute. Yes, this would be that score sheet, but there will be different versions of it. Again, we will also have the Excel version, which might be more printer friendly. We have a black and white version, which might be more printer friendly, but the format that you see, we might make a few small tweaks. That would be the one that you print out and give judges.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I will, thank you. That is very good to know. So good.
Sure. There are a couple questions about the hearings themselves and the timing, and we'll answer that in a minute. There are a couple of you, so we will definitely answer that, but I want to go through any more of the rubric questions, and then we can just definitely share information about other updates to We the People and the simulated hearings. So Rebecca's question, and I'm going to defer this back to Hank and Emily, because I know especially Hank thought long and hard about this tie-breaking process. That was one of the most, I would say, like, I don't know, it was one of the more interesting parts of the conversation. Like, how do we break ties? We kept like pushing it off and then coming back to it. And anyway, the question is, what happens if the judges rank in different orders and then all those orders that are different and submitted still yield a tie? Does the system not allow for that? Or
I suppose that would be statistically possible, but statistically really, really unlikely. I mean, if you have 18 judges, it would still be a pretty rare situation. I'm not going to say it is totally impossible, but it's unlikely. So if that was the case, what I would say, and when I was talking through the tie-break system earlier, that would be a compelling reason for the panels not to submit the ranks, but for the individual judges to submit the ranks, because it allows for more data to feed the final result.
Yeah, I think that's right. In terms of the old tiebreaker number, the old tiebreaker number triggered similar issues, that is, with the possibility of a tie. I'll just tell you that my take is I don't have a problem with flipping a coin. Now, a lot of people freak out, but my take is, look, one, if it's a tie, it's going to be a tie on two or three different metrics. It's going to be a tie on total score. It's going to be a tie on ordinal tiebreaker. So at that point, you really are not differentiating between the teams in any real fashion. 1 point, 5 points, 10 points, you're really not differentiating amongst teams very much. So I don't have a problem with flipping a coin. Like I say, I know other people have a problem with that, but remember, I'm from Virginia. And in Virginia, we had the control of our House of Delegates depend on picking a name out of a hat because we had a House of Delegates seat that was a tie. So it seems to me that if we can have democracy land in the balance based on that, then we can probably do it with We the People. but I do think that it's going to be really, really unlikely that there will be ties. So that's sort of my take. But I think it's a great question. It's always a great question.
Mhm. Another question from Sam, speaking of Virginia, the most common question I get from students on the discussion part is whether they can disagree with the analysis presented in the opening statement. So Sam, in other words, they've presented a thesis of some sort in their opening statement in response to the question, but then when they get deeper into the discussion piece, they actually want to disagree with what they initially said in their opening or show an alternate side. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, precisely. Often I'll have ideological disagreement among students, and they have to craft a statement in the end that presents a position. And there will be students who are in the minority when that statement is finally crafted and presented for the 4-minute opening. The advice I've always given them is, hey, air your grievances, right? You can disagree once you move into the discussion round, but I'd love it if there was a clearer guidance, because that's always just been my read of the situation and not a clear and specific guideline.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that in the analysis understanding, it talks about recognizing multiple perspectives, so that it definitely lives there. So we they definitely should come forth with alternate points of view, even if they differ from their opening statement. In the discussion part of the rubric, it doesn't call that type of conversation out explicitly, but I think that it lives within the rubric. So I think they can definitely do that with good faith.
Yeah, and Hank, I think, is probably the best one to speak to this, but I would say, just from the perspective of building a substantive argument, you can build a substantive argument that goes in 2 different directions if you have a panel that's split. That's totally feasible.
Right.
Yeah,
I just want to be able to reassure students that they're not going to get dinged by someone saying, "Oh, but didn't you say this in the opening statement?" Yeah, so I'm glad that I can give them that assurance. So
Yeah, and I think oh, go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of 2 pieces of the puzzle. One is the internal disagreement with the opening and the discussion. I have no problem with that. The way that I would tend to craft it is to craft the opening in slightly more general terms, and then one can get into the specifics later. There's a second question that I thought you were also asking, which maybe you weren't, but I'll go ahead and answer it anyway. And that is, what if you just have a fight with the question? And you know me, I have no problem with having fights with questions, because sometimes the questions will assume things that I don't think are necessarily 100%. Not that I think that they're wrong, it's just that they are subject to disagreement. And I have often told teams, if you don't agree with what are the assumptions that underlie the question, feel free to question that in your opening and in the discussion. Most judges are certainly going to respect you for that, particularly if you make a good argument for why the question assumes something that may not necessarily be something that everyone agrees to.
that's great. Thank you, guys.
And that was a great question. And when we work on the explainer videos, we'll try to make this type of thing as clear as possible via examples of students and how that aligns to the criteria and these different scenarios where students, it might not be 100% clear in its first implementation.
This is also a good time to reference, we have already built some supporting materials for anyone who needs it. We will be building more. And some of those are meant to be brief, like 10-minute explainer type videos. Some of them are geared to students, some would be geared to judges. That would be, just this, like a quick explanation, a verbal explanation, maybe with some little clips that anyone could watch at any time.
All right, so we have 2. Oh, let's see. Katie, I'm getting to your hearing question, but now you have another one. It appears the new rubric that the difference between evidence analysis and application are minimal. You touched on it tonight and loved the little boxes, the slides. Will you be drawing out those differences for judges and also in your teacher webinar next week? Yes, 100%. And I think in the webinar next week, we'll be using more, well, we didn't use any tonight, but we'll be using video snippets of hearings to get to those distinctions. And you know, we are always learning from our teachers as well. So in that webinar and in feedback that you're giving us, you know, whether it's in an opportunity like this or, you know, send us an email, hey, I use this in class and let me tell you where we're still struggling, or here's something we figured out. We will continue to figure out how to support teachers in the process. And as Hank mentioned, you know, we're not going to change the rubric every year, but we are open to feedback. And you know, this can be an iterative process. There have been years where questions have been changed because once they were released, you know, it was realized that we needed to quickly switch directions. So we will continue to take in that feedback, but also support, you know, really good implementation.
Yeah, and Katie, I'll tell you, like Don was saying, I think one of the reasons why we looked at this was because there was a ton of overlap in the old rubric, where really as judges we had no idea what the differences were. So it's helpful to know that there are still some concerns, and I think that's you raised some good points. And as Donna said, we'll keep on looking at that issue.
Let's see. Okay, so now the two questions about hearings have to do with the length of the hearings and so if you've competed in national finals, then what we have traditionally done is extended the Q&A period from 6 minutes to 8 minutes for the first two rounds, and then randomly to 11 minutes for the for the top 10 or top 12 teams. In some states, they have permanently extended the follow-up Q&A period to 8 minutes. Although in our program and on our website and our materials, we have not officially changed that. Emily,
Yes.
What is our official stance for the timing that we are suggesting for states? Because we will keep the longer timing. We might adjust the 11 minutes piece, but we will have a longer top 10/top 12 Q&A. We will keep the 8 minutes for the Saturday and Sunday rounds, but that's at national finals. We can still make a recommendation for state and classroom implementation to keep it at 8 minutes, because I agree, 6 minutes go way too fast.
Very fast. So we are rewriting the old judge instructions and the old timer instructions to go along with new information that we have here. I would say the state coordinator will always need to be the final determiner of the timing. The coordinators will have considerations, you know, obviously the quality of the hearing is very important. So adding it 2 extra minutes, if feasible, would be great. But if there is a state coordinator who is struggling, trying to like make sure they can fit a whole lot of hearings into a short space of time and they need to keep it to 10, then they're going to be able to keep it to 10. But yes, we would recommend 8, but 6 is fine. If you want to hang out for the whole day, make it 10.
Let me give just a slight bit of perspective from judges. At nationals, 8's fine. In local competitions, there will be times when 8 minutes will feel like 20. Now, I'm all right with having a discussion with kids who clearly have no desire to be there and would rather be somewhere else. But believe me, 8 minutes as a judge with a team that doesn't want to be there, oh, friends. So part of the question for the state coordinators have to ask themselves is, how many really strong teams do you have where you really need 8 minutes to distinguish between the top team and the second top team, right? The team that's going to go to nationals and maybe the team that goes home after doing a really strong job. That may be the question that a state coordinator's got to figure out. clearly in Virginia, 8 minutes is fine, right? At states, 8 minutes is fine. And I will say that even at nationals, on occasion, you'll get a team where, woo, even 6 minutes can be a little painful. I know it sounds odd. Frankly, that's one of the reasons why I would love for folks to be able to watch other teams, because one of the things that you would see on Saturday and Sunday is a very different quality of team top to bottom amongst the teams, which is not a knock. It just is what it is.
Thanks, Hank. So yeah, just a note to whatever state coordinators are here, as we're working on those instructions, they'll be written in more general terms, but the 4 minutes will stay 4 minutes. That part doesn't change. Was there one more hearing related question, or did we address it?
I think we got because we got the hearing questions.
Can I follow up on that? If there is a general recommendation of 8 minutes and states do something less than 8 minutes, I think that would be a stigma to the teams that do less. So I would strongly request that there either not be a recommendation, just provide a range, or provide a recommendation of the lesser amount, that coordinators can increase it if they choose.
I think that's a fair point, Rebecca. And I mean, it's also worth stating that other than your result, there's very little else about the structure of an individual state hearing that anyone else even knows. So your point is well taken, but you know, not to be concerned that somehow everyone will know if a state chooses to go a certain direction.
The teachers are going to be trained across the country, and if they hear that information and then they participate in a hearing, one participates in one that's a 10-minute follow-up and one participates in a 6-minute follow-up, you know, and they talk about it, I think it's problematic.
Yeah, I appreciate the thought. I mean, providing a range might be interesting, and that's going to give us a way to think about how we message the explainer videos and the, you know, these future trainings. And I think it's also similar to the phenomenon that we have these state level questions. You know, the true original form was that the states would use all the questions, students would prepare all the questions, use them in their state hearings for multiple rounds of hearings. And every state does it differently. Some states, it's just they say, hey, we're all doing question 1. That's all the students prepare. That's all they use in competition at the state level. That's all that gets them to nationals. And in other states, they do multiple rounds of all 3 questions at different levels. And so they show up with different levels of preparedness as well. So I think it's the same kind of phenomenon. But it's good for us to note that can create seeming inequities or stigmas. And we'll, you know, we definitely take note of that and think about our own policies behind that.